of IIUM. Today's topic is a look at contemporary right-wing extremism, which is said to be the new wave of extremism after the religious wave, the new left wave, the anti-colonial wave, and the anarchist wave, as according to a famed terrorism researcher, Dr. C. Rappaport. The UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, had warned the members of security councils that the pandemic could threaten the global peace and security. Due to this, the global conflict circles tried to bring over discussions in order to understand why this issue becomes among the spotlight during the pandemic era. I hope that at the end of this webinar, each and every one of us will gain something beneficial that will help not only ourselves, but also our society in order to achieve peace, justice, and strong institution, as has been outlined in the UN SDG. Without further ado, I will now pass the floor to Dr. Meor Alif, our beloved lecturer and also my co-moderator for today's discussion. Have fun and thank you for joining us, to everyone.
Evening, assalamualaikum everyone. Beloved is overstating it, I think. Welcome again. This is, as mentioned, this is our second session, but most importantly, Happy New Year, everyone. Happy New Year. It's been nice to have been doing this over 2 years, oddly enough, once in the end and once at the beginning. So today we have, thank you again for your time, Ms. Munira. Absolutely, we are honored. We are absolutely grateful to spend some time with you. The circle, they have been talking about this one for quite some time. And it seems like, for good or for worse, we've hit some kind of topical lottery today, all things considered, with the news, and somehow we've caught you at the right time, and perhaps we'll get questions on this. It'll be hopefully infinitely interesting. So to very quickly, because what we tend to do is we set the stage for the discussion. And I'm sure in her line of work, Ms. Munira is quite familiar with both the good and the bad of things, right? So I thought it'll be nice to start with a very quick sort of excerpt from Rudyard Kipling, right? Born in India, writes about the Jungle Book, Mowgli, Baloo, and so on. You're familiar with this, but he was also a journalist, right? During the First War. And this excerpt I'm sharing with you comes from October 19, 1916. He was, of course, a journalist with the London Daily Telegraph, right? And he was writing about the Battle of Jutland. And I found it particularly suitable and interesting for the evening. So I'll just very quickly read an excerpt of the battle. And here keep in mind, here he's talking about a few cruiser ships, right? British cruiser ships. So it goes, I take the adventures of several couples of destroyers who on the night of May 31 were nosing along somewhere towards the coast, ready to chop off any Hun stuff coming back to Earth by that particular road. The leader of one line was Gehenna, right? Leader of one line was Gehenna. So he nicknames the three cruisers involved, right? The first was the Gehenna. The next two ships astern of her were Iblis and Shaitan, right? And Shaitan in the order given. There were others, of course, but with the exception of one goblin, because he names the other two, there's three more, one goblin, and the other two, he names it cripple and paralytic, the five sort of cruisers involved. With the exception of one goblin, they don't come violently into the tale. There had been a good deal of promiscuous firing that evening, and actions were going on all around. Towards midnight, our destroyers were overtaken by several 3- and 4-funnel German ships, cruisers they thought, hurrying home. At this stage of the game, anybody might have been anybody. Anybody might have been anybody, pursuer or pursued. The Germans took no chances, but switched on their searchlights and opened fire on Gehenna. Her acting sub-lieutenant reports, a salvo hit us forward. I opened fire with the afterguns. A shell then struck us in a steam pipe, and I could see nothing but steam, but both starboard torpedo tubes were fired. Iblis, Gehanna's next astern, at once fired a torpedo at the second ship in the German line, a 4-funnel cruiser, and hit her between the second funnel and the main mast, and she appeared to catch fire fore and aft simultaneously, heeled right over the starboard, and undoubtedly sank. Iblis loosed off a second torpedo and turned aside to reload, firing at the same time to distract the enemy's attention from Gehanna, who was now ablaze fore and aft. Gehanna's acting sub-lieutenant, the only executive officer who survived, says that by the time the steam from the broken pipe cleared and he found Gehanna stopped, nearly everybody amidship killed or wounded. The cartridge boxes around the guns exploding one after the other as the fires took hold and the enemy not be seen. 3 minutes or less did all the damage. Iblis had nearly finished reloading when the shot struck the David and was swinging her last torpedo into the tube and wounded all hands concerned. Thereupon, she dropped torpedo work, fired at an enemy searchlight, which winked and went out and was closing in to help Gehanna when she found herself under the noses of a couple enemy cruisers. The nearer one, he says, altered course to ram me, apparently. The senior service writes in curiously lawyer-like fashion, but there's no denying that they act quite directly. I therefore put my helm hard a port, and the two ships met and rammed each other port bow to port bow. There could have been no time to think, and for Iblis's commander on the bridge, none to gather information, but he had observant subordinates, and he writes, and I would humbly suggest that the words be made the ship's motto forevermore, he writes. Those aft noted that the enemy cruiser had certain marks on her funnel and certain arrangements of derricks on each side, which quite apart from the evidence she left behind, her betrayed her class. Says Iblis, I consider I must have considerably damaged this cruiser, as 20 feet of her side plating was left in my obstacle. 20 feet of ragged rivets slinging, steel razoring and reaping about in the dark on the forcicle, and had collapsed like a concertina. It was very fair plating too. There was side scuttle holes in it, what we passenger would call potholes, but it might have been better for Iblis, reports sorrowfully, by the thickness of the coats of paint duly given, she would not appear to have been a very new ship. So I'm quite confident Miss Munira is very familiar with the Gehannas and the Iblises and the goblins and the shaitans in and around places. So we look forward to hearing about right-wing extremism from the expert today. So I'll pass it on. Please do.
Should I start?
Yep.
Oh, I didn't realize. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me as I talk about contemporary right-wing extremism today. Thank you both Dr. Meor and Arina for moderating this talk. Thank you for inviting me to do this and be part of the POSA IIUM webinar series on the global conflict. And thank you to Izzuddin as well for organizing this, and to the rest of the team as well. I'm very excited to be here. So before we begin, I'll just shortly introduce myself. I'm Munira Mustaffa. You can just call me Munira, it's fine. I'm an analyst with the ISD, with the Counterterrorism Department. It's a division of the Malaysian Armed Forces. And as a disclaimer, anything I say here in the form of opinion in this session does not reflect the ISD position. So I need to emphasize that. Before this, I was working at the Southeast Asia Regional Center for Counterterrorism in Kuala Lumpur on matters related to CVE, that is countering violent extremism. Some of my previous projects were focused on counter-narrative and strategic communications. So a lot of my work focused on analyzing threats on jihadi terrorism and terrorist events at both local and global level. I have local, regional, and global level. I have worked on various regional desks, including Europe, South Asia, the Middle East, and on the academic side, my research interests include learning about terrorist organizational behavior, their networks, along with their tactics and strategies. That's my favorite. My most recent write-up involved evaluating the so-called successful 2016 Islamic State terrorist grenade attack on Movidabar in Puchong. So what I'm going to talk about today is a different kind of threat, and that is the rise of contemporary right-wing extremism. Now, I'd like to emphasize that this is not actually a new form of threat. It's an old wine in new bottle kind of situation. Think of it as a resurgence of a dormant ideology that was once rejected by the larger mainstream population. And then it has now been fashioned to fit in with today's turbulent political sense and cultural context. So we are truly living in one of the most interesting times today. And because we are witnessing a series of events that are somehow triggered by something as innocuous as video games. So what is going on out there? You've seen the headlines, you've seen the videos and the tweets. All these that we see today did not just happen in vacuum. How could a cultural explosion that happened in the US and across Europe could affect Malaysia? Now, this is why I'm going to begin by talking about right-wing extremism in the global sense before narrowing it down to relate to local contexts. So right-wing extremism is not just a US problem, it's not just a Europe problem. And according to the UN Security Council's Counterterrorism Committee, there has been an upsurge, 320% increase in right-wing terrorism globally between 2015 to 2020. So first, if I'm going too fast, just let me know, because sometimes when I get really nervous, I tend to go super fast. So first, I'm going to explain what extremism is. Extremism and terrorism are often conflated with each other, but they're not the same. So all terrorists are extremists, but not all extremists are terrorists. So to borrow J.M. Burgess' definition, he said it better. Extremism refers to the belief that an in-group success or survival can never be separated from the need for hostile action against an outgroup. So in other words, if you don't belong to a particular group, and this could be due to your identity, ethnicity, gender, or religion, then you don't belong in that space at all. So an extremist would then resort to violence to remove your presence from that space. So many groups on the far right are ideologically motivated extremists. They are part of a movement that promotes nationalist and supremacist ideals while rejecting minority rights, egalitarian values, or equality rights, liberal freedom, and the process of law. So right-wing groups tend to perceive nations and people as unequal. So they rank these by worth while positioning themselves at the top. And then they often repel political and cultural pluralism. They just don't believe in diversity. Right-wing extremists tend to glorify history, where they see themselves as the more superior, dominant, and powerful class. So they like being exclusive. And this characteristic manifests itself in racist expressions and xenophobic behavior. They are chauvinistic. Anyone who does not look like them or share their values will be excluded and discriminated against. They also tend to see they also tend to see themselves as the more morally superior, while everyone else is morally bankrupt. They believe a corrupt society can be fixed through strict ethnic control and traditional social hierarchy to achieve purity. So they tend to promote a culture of masculinity and favor law and order, and they have very idealistic views of military culture. So they have no qualms with committing violence to achieve total purity, because to them, violence is a form of a cleansing act. Far-right groups also reject politics and values of the left, such as socialism and communism, which they consider to be a threat that can influence people to reject nationalist and traditional value. And often, far-right adherents are informed by anti-rationalist thinking and cultural pessimism. So, So let's step into the time machine and let's go back to the year 2011. While the rest of the world was captivated by the dramatic event that was sweeping across the Middle East, there was the Arab Spring, and then there's the rise of the Islamic State. In the warm summer month of July, Anders Breivik had set off a bomb in Oslo, Norway, and he went on a shooting rampage at a political summer camp for young people. The attack had left 77 people dead. And since then, we started to see a trend of similar attacks in the West that often target minorities, and victims are often Muslims, Black, or immigrants. A few of them specifically targeted women too. For instance, there was the Wisconsin Sikh temple shooting in 2012, where 40-year-old Wade Michael Page shot 6 people dead and wounded 4 others. Significantly, there was, so this one is important, there was the 2014 Isla Vista killings, when Elliot Rodger killed 6 people and wounded others before killing himself. In 2017, in Charlottesville, Virginia, the infamous vehicle ramming attack happened when the perpetrator, James Alex Fields Jr., deliberately mowed down into a crowd of people protesting the Unite the Right rally, killing Heather Heyer. The following year, in 2018, Alex Minassian drove a van and plowed into pedestrians in Toronto, in Canada, and killed 10 people. More recently, the Christchurch mosque shootings in New Zealand, perpetrated by Brenton Tarrant in March of 2019, was the most recent terrorist incident that highlighted the manifestation of a growing and globalized ideology of white nationalism. And this is what all these events had in common. So the actors who carried out all these attacks were all young white men who espoused either neo-Nazi, white supremacist, misogynistic, racist, and or nationalist beliefs. However, despite the widespread condemnation of these attacks, we also see a different response to these events. Instead of outright rejection of these violence, there are people who become even more mobilized, emboldened, and empowered to embrace far-right ideology even more. So in other words, the attacks themselves became a radicalizing agent. The key question we should ask ourselves is, why are they even more willing to adopt these ideologies that seek to discriminate, dehumanize, and devalue others? So let's go back to 2012. Anita Sarkeesian, a feminist critic, started a crowdfunding campaign for her video series called Tropes versus Women in Video Games. Now, the effort invited an army of online trolls attacking her. The following year, in 2013, an independent game developer named Zoe Queen produced a game called Depression Quest, based on her experience with depression. So while the game received generally positive reviews in the gaming media, many gamers disparaged it because it wasn't traditional by gaming standards. A lot of them were complaining about Zoe injecting politics into gaming culture. And at the same time, Quinn had broken up with her boyfriend, and her now ex-boyfriend then created a blog post describing very personal, very graphic, very detailed accounts of their relationship and breakup, along with copies of personal chat logs, emails, text messages, things like that. So the blog post also implied that Quinn had cheated on him with someone else. And following that, like Sarkeesian, Quinn was subjected to intense harassment, including rape and death threats. This was also around the time when the word doxing entered our lexicon. So what happened was someone had posted Quinn's personal home address online. So as a result, Quinn had to flee. She had to leave her home because people were threatening to come and kill her. Anyone who tried to stick up to for Quinn online was immediately branded as social justice warriors and SJWs or white knights. Some of you may remember this incident as Gamergate, #Gamergate. Gamergate became a cultural phenomenon that highlighted intensifying online misogyny that targeted women in the gaming industry. This was an intense and violent response to efforts of diversifying video games and the gaming industry at large. The gaming industry, the gaming community is perceived to be a male-dominated space, often white. So all these efforts at diversifying was seen as a threat to them and to their existence. So Gamergate was often described as an anti-feminist movement that seek to exclude women, non-white, and non-binary people. Some individual and tactics mobilized in the Gamergate scandal then transcend to the alt-right movement. Hang on, I'm just gonna get sip water. So the reason I mentioned Gamergate in this talk because it is often overlooked component in conversations relating to the alt-right and far-right movements. In many alt-right communities, men are encouraged to view women as sexual and or political targets that men must dominate. There is a deep inclination to return to what was considered as pure and traditional, where women are absent. And these guys consider themselves as traditionalists. So when the fourth wave feminism started to hit its stride in 2013, Gamergate was a manifestation of that anti-feminist response. More importantly, Gamergate formed the basis of the contemporary far-right movement. So key Gamergate figureheads, such as Milo Yiannopoulos, then became one of the central figures in the mainstream growth of the alt-right movement. So if you think about it, it's pretty crazy, right? Basically, a video game culture was the catalyst for the right-wing extremism that we see today. And and then the advent of incel culture further escalated misogyny and far-right extremism online. And they very often overlap. So, excuse me, incel subculture, also known as the involuntary celibates, is a violent movement that began as an online support group for frustrated heterosexual young men who are not successful in their romantic endeavors. They often blame their failure on finding a sexual partner on women. So they see themselves as the superior gender because they are by default male. So they embrace the idea of male supremacy and violent subjugation of women. So a rejection by women is a rejection of their masculine values and identity. In other words, it's a rejection of their masculinity itself. So in response, they turn this anger into calls of violence because they believe women deserve to be punished for rejecting them. In the case of Elliot Rodger, which I mentioned earlier, it's an example of the startling transition from online harassment to real-world violent consequences. So then, if you think about it, the mobilization tactics used by the Gamergate mob was then used to target Hillary Clinton and journalists covering Trump during the 2016 election. At the same time, the public had also failed to understand that the outright misogyny, racism, and violent rhetoric were not exclusively an online phenomenon. So more importantly, a lot of people do not realize that at the center of the hyperbolic alt-right internet memes was genuine white nationalist rhetoric. This was how Gamergate was able to morph into the alt-right because people had underestimated the impact of online trolling, and that had real-life daily consequences. What was thought to be a juvenile, immature behavior obscures an actual and physically violent intent that gave rise to a prominent populist movement during and after the 2016 election campaign. And on top of that, Donald Trump gave legitimacy to the alt-right members, which emboldened them even further. Make America great again. It entered into our collective consciousness. When Trump won the election in 2016, he basically activated and endorsed his right-wing follower base. Of course, his supporters, many of them which consisted of the far right and alt-right, became even more invigorated during his presidential term. So Trump did nothing to reject or neutralize or quell these expressions of violence, both online and offline. And we've seen this. Of course he wouldn't, because he wouldn't want to lose his voters. When the murder of George Floyd happened and the Black Lives Matter protests broke across America, you could see the polemical language that Trump employed was very deliberately shaped to validate the actions of the alt-right and the far-right. So instead of making any efforts to reunite the American citizens, Trump leaned towards heightening divisiveness instead. So the mantra is pretty simple: divide and conquer. And hey, that works. And for the alt-right, right, and the far-right folks, they have a president that practically endorses and approves their brand of violence. So think of it as a form of high-level enabling. He only told Proud Boys to stand down and let law enforcement to do their work. after refusing to condemn white supremacist groups in the US presidential debate. Trump has been challenged and criticized for branding anti-racism protesters as terrorists, and also for expressing his willingness to employ violent coercive tactics to repress and suppress those who challenge his administration, while at the same time dismissing right-wing and white supremacist violence. So these have ramifications on existing counterterrorism policies and responses for US partners globally. Language matters. Symbolism is vital. So today, we are seeing that momentum and consequences of unbridled right-wing extremism. We're seeing how violent online culture can be translated into violent grassroots movements. The situation is evolving on the ground, even as we speak. The fact that Twitter was forced to ban Trump for 12 hours is an important point that I'm going to touch on. So a lot of the conversations of these movements take place on the internet. Social media such as Facebook, Twitter, 4chan, they're all an important platform for them to converge. This is a space where they can find like-minded people like themselves, where they can validate each other's worldview. It has become their echo chamber. More importantly, this is the space where they can freely sow propaganda and disseminate relentless misinformation and incessant conspiracy theories in the form of incendiary Facebook posts, provocative Twitter tweets, and subversive memes. So to borrow Marc-Andre Argentino's explanation, QAnon is a decentralized, ideologically motivated, and violent movement rooted in an unfounded conspiracy theory that a global deep state cabal of satanic pedophile elites is responsible for all the evil in the world. QAnon followers also believe that this so-called deep state cabal is aiming to bring Trump down. So they believe that Trump is their savior, their prophet, so to speak, who can save them from the clutches of this cabal. The violence at the Capitol that we saw today, earlier today, in the news today, is a product of these online movements. They believe that Trump did not lose the election. They believe that the election was stolen from Trump. Why wouldn't they? Because Trump said so. Trump has said so many times. In short, facts don't matter to any of them at all when the president himself said facts are lies. So could something have been done to disrupt this, to prevent this? Possibly. One of the reasons why this movement flourished and thrived is because their presence was severely underestimated and even tolerated. They were not seen as a potential security threat. It is important to remember that when Gamergate happened, their danger was dismissed because the movement was mostly rooted in misogyny and anti-feminist rhetoric. So no one really took them seriously because they only impacted women and minorities, and they didn't affect the status quo. So social media forums and chat rooms transformed into an ecosystem for violent ideologies to take root. So also, the global COVID-19 pandemic made matters worse. The UN has warned that the far right has latched on to the pandemic as an opportunity to radicalize, recruit, inspire plots and attacks, and even also unrest. The pandemic also lent credence to xenophobic sentiments even more, and drove conspiratorial narratives at a frenetic pace. So also, social media companies, have been very slow at responding to this swirling vortex of post-truth America. Back then, a lot of their efforts were mostly focused on ejecting the presence of Islamic State members and followers online. Laws were amended to adapt to the changing social norms, and policymakers wanted social media companies cooperation in shutting them down. So this was when the Islamic State was producing their propaganda materials and disseminated them online to increase recruitment drive for new members and obtain popular support. So they were, and probably still are, very active on messaging apps such as Telegram. You could find their magazines on these platforms and apps, but not anymore now because since then, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, all of them have, I think all of them, have unrolled their violent organizations policy and actively removed these accounts. So Telegram would shut down any groups and channels that contain Islamic State membership and materials. So at the same time, security agencies place a strong focus on Islamist extremism without putting much consideration on the rising threat of right-wing extremism. The Oslo attack by Anders Breivik should have been that early warning sign for the emergence of the far-right movement. But they treated far-right movements, right-wing movements, differently in these spaces. Some say this could be due to systemic Islamophobia, but the fact is, Twitter and Facebook were, still are actually, struggling with trying to make sense and to determine and identify what is considered to be right-wing extremism because they have been so normalized. Some argued that censoring the far right would collide with their freedom of speech ideals. So racist comments and hate speech are often conflated with free speech. Misogynistic statements and rape threats were often ignored on Twitter, or at least dealt with, albeit very, very slowly. It takes from what I've noticed in my experience, when I want to report about a malicious account online, it usually takes, sometimes there's no response. Either there's no response or sometimes it takes a great mobilization. I had to get my friends and my friends had to get their friends to mass complain for them to pick up and notice that this account is acting out. So influencers are freely endorsing conspiracy theories and anti-vaccination movement, anti-vax, on YouTube and Instagram, and they are in the guise of lifestyle, beauty, and health. And in return, they even receive endorsement themselves in the form of blue ticks, which validates their brand even further. So then we see Twitter and Facebook actively update their policies to tackle abuse and harassment and ban any users who are being abusive online. But herein lies the difficulty. Facebook has over 2 billion users online. I mean, 2 billion users monthly online. And Twitter has over 300 million users monthly, active users, to mention data accounts. So that is too many people to moderate for the human employees to deal with. So they deploy artificial intelligence, AI, and machine learning algorithms to sort, police, and moderate content. But this takes time. Meanwhile, far-right content was being produced and spread out at higher volumes and faster rates. It is becoming increasingly overwhelming for these platforms to catch up and evaluate each complaint of abusive and hazardous content. So at one point, they only discovered after the fact that YouTube had unintentionally facilitated far-right, right-wing radicalization by promoting hazardous content as part of their user interaction design and service engagement. They had assumed that their algorithm results would be neutral, but extremists are not neutral actors. So if you watch one violent content, the YouTube algorithm will very likely suggest to you to watch another violent content. I'm sure you remember this. This is automated. If you were watching conspiracy videos or videos that promote anti-vaccination, you will get YouTube suggestions to watch more videos like that. So not to mention the existence of YouTube and Instagram existence of YouTube and Instagram influencers who also thrive in sharing dangerous information and practices. So this is how ideologies and misinformation spread at rapid fire in the far right space. So what we saw today was Twitter and Facebook exercising their policy on dangerous and violent speeches online by banning Trump, because he was egging on the actors who stormed the Capitol. But this is a case of too little, too late. The violence today had been openly planned for weeks on both mainstream and social media, and the pro-Trump platform, Parler, The question is, why were they ignored and at what cost? Is this a case of bad faith in that these actors would not act on their promises and simulate chaos despite all their say-sos that they're going to commit violence? Who knows? So that's a lot of lessons learned. So what do all these have to do with Malaysia? It is worth remembering that Malaysians make up about 30 million users, 30 million social network users in the demographic. So last checked by last December, about 86% of us are active social media users. We consume news online. We shop for goods, for food, clothes on Lazada and Shopee. Instagram has recently introduced a market space for business owners and influencers to promote themselves and products. But it is worth remembering that casual lifestyles and entertainment are not the only presence online. Political conversation and movements are taking root within our space too. So the ethno-nationalist and far-right movement are not only endemic to the West. So they can exist in any society. Like take India's case, for example, with Hindutva. That's their version of far-right movements. So what we can learn from the American experience is that policymakers need to be able to recognize strains of violence, strains of toxic behavior, and dangerous ideology that could translate into real world consequences and figure out a way to disrupt and mitigate them without jeopardizing our autonomy or civil liberties. So we are just as, if not, we're actually pretty vulnerable to this kind of messaging. In fact, a lot of the local influencers on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, have content and style that mirror the US right-wingers. So when a popular influencer or a prominent public figure introduces, promotes, or endorses supremacist ideology and abusive behavior online, that tend to have a strong impact offline. So the challenge in this is that many of these are manifested in mainstream ideas, and they have been so normalized. This is why we need to be able to be more cognizant of populist hyperbole masked by what seem to be juvenile, obscure, and malicious badgering. So hateful rhetoric requires active rejection and denunciation from us. They must not be normalized at all. So what are the takeaways from all this talk? We learned that nothing ever happens in vacuum. We learned that gender-based violence and racism have severe political impact. We learned that online subculture can propagate and have influence. We learned that when we ignore harmful ideologies and malicious actors, they often do not go away. I mean, how many times we've heard that statement from people? Just ignore them, and they're just bored. They'll go away soon enough, but they don't. Instead, they can transform and mobilize themselves into dangerous movements that seek to stimulate disunity and chaos. It is worth asking ourselves, what can be done in response to all of these? So policymakers need to work even more closely with social media companies to identify and target any spaces or movements that endorse ethno-nationalist and supremacist ideologies while promoting divisiveness, inequality, and disunity. So we need to explore options that could address local grievances without senseless censorship and diminishing anyone's value and dignity as a human and member of society. I think I went too fast.
Thank you very much. You've presented a very interesting, multifaceted puzzle for everyone, because it seems like the issue is on top, which enables, and then there's multiple sort of channels in which the toxic behavior sort of percolates and then is transmitted into society. I mean, of course, then those people who shun a blind eye, they take it for granted, and then of course it becomes a policy matter. It becomes an issue, a legalese sort of situation, because there needs to be a policy to combat such potentialities for criminality, potentialities for hate crime, and so on. It's absolutely interesting. I think what I'll do, we'll proceed immediately to the questions. I see there's a few questions written here. I'll read it out. You can take a sip, one more sip, should be fine. Catch a breath. I have one from Rowena Abdul Razak. Thank you so much for a wonderful, well thought out, comprehensive and deeply analytical presentation, Munira. Well done. I was wondering if you could talk a little about the role of women in far-right extremism in the West and in Asia. While toxic masculinity is prevalent in these moments, many women are part of them. Thank you very much, from Rowena.
Okay, so this is a complicated question to reply to respond to, because it's such it's an obviously misogynistic misogynistic movement. So why would women want to belong to this kind of political sphere? And then we see women like Tomi Lahren and Candace Owens endorsing this, and this is partly because I think this is probably due to very profound internalized misogyny, that the idea that we need to put men to put masculinity on a pedestal, there should be no equal positions between us. So that's why a lot of these women adhere to these far right movements, because, and a lot of them a lot of them internalize this idea of suffocation and traditionalist values. Does that make sense?
Hang on. Yes, definitely. Fantastic. Yeah, Rowena says yes, definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. We have one more from Professor Ishtia. He's saying politicians should stop manipulating the sentiments of people and use them as voter banks. In the US, ultimately, the institutions worked. This is interesting as well, because it brings out another sort of issue, which is what is the level of cooperation, I guess, because now what you're saying is that there should be a type of special police online, in a way, a type of joint sort of action between policymakers and social media sort of companies, especially taking into consideration the influencers and what they do within the umbrella of these companies and so on. So in terms of institutions, is that the way forward? Should there be, should we be branching out into policing, in some sense, social media and the internet in that way?
So I think this is a case of learning as we go, because we're moving in a frenetic pace along with technology. Technology is evolving, and we're very instrumentalist in employing that technology. So often the Twitter policies have to change every single time because of events and things like this. And this is the case where very much like security agencies, they are always one step behind of malicious actors. So from what I know is that Twitter and Facebook have their own security department, where they have designated people to look into this kind of dangerous content, to analyze the threat level, things like that, and it can be regional. But it's like I said earlier, the problem is that there are way too much content out there, and there's only so many people you can employ to look at these, and a lot of them experience burnouts and are traumatized by what they're seeing online. So at best, at the moment, the best content moderation that they can deploy at the moment is to just cut off the content by banning, removal, that kind of actions. So it's not ideal because again, it's for those who adhere to the first, because the U.S. have the First Amendment, this kind of create a kind of a very muddled conversation, because at what point does it go against their First Amendment? And so there's a lot of questions with regards to censorship as well. But at some point, you have to cut off the oxygen and stop them, because that's what worked for the Islamic State to an extent, because then they move deeper underground and it's getting harder to monitor them as well.
Yeah. And it goes back to your initial sort of what you were explaining, that it's very specific types of features that they tend to display, a type of admiration over military culture, excluding individuals, correct? A type of idealizing of their version of history and so on. So I was asking because I was wondering if there's a way that we can very quickly detect the red flags and then know that these are, because it was done, as you've mentioned, with IS and so on. There's of course a way to identify the pattern of, I guess, what they're saying on the whole. Probably, maybe that's the way forward, perhaps.
Sorry about that. So I remember someone said that so this is where it gets complicated, because I think it just actually it's been reported several times before as well. They have far right members even within the ranks of army and police as well, and this has shown itself as becoming a serious problem that's very clearly very overwhelming to counter. So I remember reading somewhere that amongst the red flags of problematic behavior is domestic abuse. That's always a red flag. Their behavior, again, is like I mentioned earlier, the subjugation, the violent subjugation of women. It is often expressed in those terms, like they devalue the person's worth. So that's one of the key signs to look for.
Yep.
Then that they espouse statements, ideologies that tend to be very, very discriminating.
Yep. Yep. I think you can take one more sip of your drink, because this next one will be sizable. I'll combine two of the questions because I think the first one will ask you a bit of a background over the thing which follows it, the question which will be relevant to sort of the background. You'll understand what I mean by it once I read it. So here goes. It's a bit long, right? It's a bit long. Roxanne, she's asking, is the fact that the Nazis didn't invade the US color the American response to the far right extreme sort of movements? And then there's a bit of background here to say the era of the Red Scare seems to put the fear of the far left into the common sort of American mental state, but it doesn't seem to show the same fear for Nazis or any far right groups, right? The US also seems to have a particular breed of far right white supremacy that mixes unique or extremist versions of Christianity, again, as you were speaking, along with far-right ideals in groups such as the Aryan Brotherhood, the Covenant, sort of an arm of the Lord. And then the question continues. It's interesting to read the interactions between incels and those who describe themselves as alt-right, especially with the idea of having a traditional wife, trad wife, again, as you've mentioned, and the right to have sexual partners and so on. So that's the first part, right? Because it's then extended by Dr. Shaza. She's here. She's asking, I was just wondering how you would relate right-wing extremism and fascism. Are they one of the same, right? And then she goes on further, bringing it closer to home. She was wondering, given your experience, do the Malaysian government take ethno-nationalist extremists in the country as seriously as Islamist extremists, or are they sort of treated differently because it's more rhetorical than action-based? I hope that's clear.
So that's a bit complicated. So I'm going to try to tackle that one by one.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start with the Nazism question. So yes, I think that's pretty much clear that there seems to be a higher tolerance for Nazi presence compared to communism, to contemporary communist and socialism movement, and I think this could go back to the history, back to history, World War II history, Aristotle. So I can't profess that I'm an expert in history, but what I think is that it's partly because we're some of the explanations I've seen is that it's a kind of a capitalist world we're living in, and socialism, communism would threaten the existence of capitalism, and that's why the very mention of communism and socialism tend to get a lot of knees jerked. So I think that's one of the reasons why the hostility towards any communism or socialist values is a lot
Yeah.
stronger compared to Nazis. Like I think someone once, I remember some mentioned, oh, I'm okay with Nazis, just
Yeah.
while.
Yeah. And then the second part was, is the ethno-nationalist situation taken seriously, as seriously as Islamist sort of extremists? Or is it different because it's more rhetorical? Is there, I guess also the question might be, is there a threshold of a sense of danger that's sort of well established maybe?
So to my knowledge, and I could be wrong about this, I'm not sure if we categorize any movements as ethno-nationalists in Malaysia in that extent, and not the same
Yeah.
as terrorist groups. We designate terrorist groups differently, and
Yeah.
partly is because we follow the UN convention. So it's hard to talk about ethno-nationalist movements in Malaysia because maybe they are expressed in a, and again it's like I mentioned earlier, in such a normalized way that it's kind of difficult to discern how extreme it is, and what is the threshold, and the question is what threshold do we decide that it's extreme enough to be
Yeah.
rejected.
Yeah. And I think everyone's wondering this, like in terms of, because I suppose everyone's thinking about it, like are the outrightly, or are they fascists, or are the fascists different from the alt-right? I mean, people struggle to sometimes see the distinction. Like in your mind, like what is there a similarity? Like what do you have to say on this?
So I think they all fall under the right wing extremism spectrum, but alt
Mm.
right is
Okay.
basically a polite euphemism to describe a Nazi.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it seems like it. It seems like it. Okay. And then there's a second question, adding on to Shazia just now. It's along the same line. It seems to be there seems to be a rise in Malay ethno-nationalist presence online with explicit and implied call to violence. Should we be worried? I think we should, as we've heard. And then Shazia saying, I was trying to avoid calling out Malay nationalists as extremists, but thank you to myself and to you. There's one more. Is there any questions from the crowd? Is there a spoken question? Can we head to a spoken question? Anyone?
Yeah, can I have ask one question?
Of course, yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Okay. So regarding about your presentation, how do you try to relate it that the in a Malaysia situation about how we treat the refugee, and so some people in Malaysia they unpleased with the refugee from Rohingya, Syria, and some other else. So how do you think that? Is it because they think that we as a as an owner, as a tuan rumah, and do we, is it some kind of little bit extreme to xenophobic, or they say that we just want to defend our right and our privilege. So same thing with the Malay supremacy. So sometimes they sometimes people call them. Some people think that there is a racism. Sometimes it's a nationalist. So how we try to define the label that we give to them. That's all. Thank you.
So I think we are living in a very overwhelming time. For all the way from the 9/11 to Iraq War, and to the rise to Arab Spring, to the rise of Islamic State and terrorism, in our neighboring countries, and even here, we've experienced this turbulent times. And then there's a pandemic, and then there are ruptures of political situations in other countries, and people are trying to escape that pain, that agony, agonizing situation, and seek betterment of their lives. It's a very difficult question that I'm not sure what would be the answer, because I think we're all struggling to find the right answer to address this, and at the same time being overwhelmed by a lot of ongoing things, and then so it's a natural impulse to try and defend our borders first, and then address the refugee situation second. It's not ideal, but that is how it is. And I think even a lot of countries that want to open up their borders are dealing with because there's a clash of policy and people. That makes sense. So trying to navigate that fine balance, that the fine space is not enviable at all for any policymakers, for any state heads at all. So they have to make a choice, and the choice is to prioritize their nation, and it's so with regards to the rejection of the refugees, asylum seekers, it's a very painful situation, and it's a very difficult one as well, because I think there are willingness to help, and at the same time there are also very adverse rhetoric against them as well, and that is where everything collides, because you want to try and balance favor without fear. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sounds like we're trying to avoid a Gamergate, right? And
Yeah.
also avoid in the war situation, the higher level sort of enabling you were referring to, because it seems like and I suppose because people are worried as well, as suggested by you as well, the small sort of toxic things that we take for granted, right? Like the immigrants, or the refugees, and these type of things, and then it seeps into, because again I would think a Gamergate sort of situation is particular to a very specific segment in society, those who are because it feels like there's not enough people knowing about how it goes, like what happens, that all the doxing part, the parts where people get harassed, the parts where people are unwillingly sort of cornered into a situation, and then even worse, the bully gets encouraged by this echo chamber you were talking about. That's interesting, like the notion of refugees being a horizon of potential sort of extremism is interesting, both the question and the answer. Anyone else who has a spoken question? Thank you everyone for the questions so far. Anyone else?
Actually, I do have a question. It's kind of related to all what has been said. My name is Abdul Majid, and I'm a political science student. And so with the significant increase of right-wing extremism, especially in the West, as they are defined or seen as the defenders of human rights, freedom of speech, freedom in general. So how this would affect the criteria of human rights if the right-wing group took full control of power? will there be changes in defining human rights or?
So yeah. So to answer that, I hope I understood your question correctly, but to me, in my opinion, human rights values do, it doesn't they're not even how to say they don't matter to right wing extremists. They like I said earlier, they reject any notions of equality in society. Therefore, they would reject human rights as well. So I don't think that is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I'm thinking, guys, will there bend, their extremism to, or will they shape the definition of human rights to fit their, their ideologies?
So
I mean,
uh-huh.
yeah. I mean, would they say this is right to us, so you should follow this?
So something like that. They position themselves as the dominant and superior class. So with that said, I don't think equality is what they're seeking. They're not seeking to for betterment of others. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, kind of. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Anyone else from the crowd? Any more other spoken questions?
I have a question.
Okay, one more.
Dr. Munira,
is that okay, Munira? You're fine?
Yeah, no, I'm fine.
Okay, good.
Fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so Dr. Munira, you mentioned previously that policymakers need to work close with social media companies and generally people who have a presence online to sort of control the the far right, or the people who believe in conspiracies and whatnot. But what if, and this is a worst case scenario, as much like what we're seeing in the United States right now, what if a number of policymakers, maybe not a majority, but a substantial number of policymakers appear to have been captured by these ideologies? I think there were a few Congress Republican House members who expressed sympathy at best, and at worst solidarity with with QAnon, with some of the fringe theories that make up the US far right. Say, for example, that unfolds here. I don't think our institutions are perhaps as experienced or strong enough as the US to withstand such a thing. So in that situation, what would be in your opinion, what would be the most prudent course of action, if there is any? Thank you.
Sorry, you mean if there's someone within the rank of politicians would agree with the QAnon, with the far right movements? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, if like maybe, I don't know, maybe 40% have sympathies towards QAnon or any other far right theories or movements, then what could we possibly do? For example.
So that's what they're trying to figure out, because they're, bless you. So because they're trying to get the leadership, to the politicians, to try and outrightly reject those ideologies. But the problem is that they're already a bit clear of the sympathies. So I think for the next 2 weeks, when Trump will finally leave, if he leaves the White House we'll have I think these are going to be turbulent times, because it's going to be interesting to see how the politicians will respond to this violence. So as mentioned, to diffuse this, what all they need to do is just to reject this behavior, renounce this behavior, renounce this movement, renounce this ideology. But they're not going to do that. That is the problem.
Can I have a go at an easy one? How do you report on Twitter? Maybe not everyone knows how to do it.
Sorry?
How do you report something on Twitter? What is the typical sort of hurdle or process? Because you were mentioning it. I think that's the easiest way forward. Like anytime you see something pernicious, perhaps you may want to report it, and it's perhaps not something everyone knows. Can you share? Is there a method? Like, is there a way to do it?
Yeah. So all you have to do is go to the profile and click on the report option. But then the report option has several kinds of categories. You want to report this guy for harassment, abuse, or for creating a false account or spamming account and things like that. And you have to select all these categories. But there is a weakness in the system, because sometimes the behavior, although abusive behavior, but they don't naturally fit in any of those boxes, and then you're stuck, because how are you going to proceed with this complaint? So you try to pick the next best option, but the problem is when you do that, and it gets sent forward, you're not getting a human person responding to this complaint. You're getting an AI, the machine learning. So what this machine does, the computer does, is to scrutinize the account to see what is the malicious behavior that they're exhibiting. And often this machine learning, this AI, are taught and fed with red flag words, like the bad words and things like that. That's how they try to assess and decide if the account is abusive. But that is the limitation of the AI, because it cannot capture context. So when it sees something that looks normal to them but is abnormal to us, it will say, this report is a waste of time, so I'm just gonna reject. And then you get a report saying that, sorry, your report is we find this account does not violate any of our terms and policies and things like that. And it's a very exasperating, frustrating endeavor.
Yeah, and the social media companies, they know of the process and how, so they are well aware of the issue, right?
I'm sure they're aware. A lot of people have complained about this so many times. But again, this is technology. While it's great, it has its limits, and this is where the limits are. And we can only move forward and try to adapt to the situation as it evolves. And then we feed into the machine the contextual changes. And then it's just backstop.
Yep. Okay. Final questions. Any spoken ones? Any written ones? There's one quick one here. Any comments about the CT-CVE interagency cooperation in Malaya that you can share? In Malaysia that you can share? Excuse me, I keep on saying Malaya. Malaysia that you can share?
All I can say is that it's as I mentioned earlier, that there is a active prohibition on any terrorist materials online.
Okay.
So that's the level of cooperation that we're doing, because Malaysia and partnering countries have are participating in this kind of prohibition, where we do not allow or endorse any terrorist material online. We have an active ban in place. And we have laws and regulations to regulate. That's why if you are caught downloading any of these materials, you can get served with jail sentence.
Okay. Just as you were explaining that, I don't think they're letting you off so easily. There's one more from Izham Hakim. He's saying, hi Munira, great explanation on the topic. I was wondering, based off your explanations on how far-right movements are born, juvenile, misogynist treatments towards women, any region in the world would not be free from giving birth to ethno-nationalist movements. Thus, it seems like it's completely impossible to avoid the rise of such movements. Therefore, is there a model that we can refer to that is the golden standard in suppressing the extremist movement, or is it categorized together under counterterrorism?
So that's also a complicated question to ask, because in my opinion, I think that no country can escape from any violent movement. There's always someone within society who decides, you know what, I'm just gonna mess around and be a jerk to everyone, and because I just feel like it. So what's going on is that I'm trying to think. Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Is there a model that we can refer to that is the golden standard in suppressing the extremist movement, or is it just categorized together under counterterrorism?
So yeah, I was gonna go there because the countries that we thought were models turned out to have their own extremists, like New Zealand. New Zealand is a very nice, lovely country, and suddenly they had the shooting that shocked everyone. Which is why I tend to be a bit cynical about this. Which is why I think that there's always a black sheep trying to stir this unity, because and this have been known to happen because it's just a form of grievance, and it's been said that far right fascist movements tend to thrive when there's an economic collapse and when they're struggling for jobs and things like that. And that's a situation where they feel inclined to blame outsiders for the for that unfortunate circumstances. And we've seen that throughout this year, that throughout the whole of 2020, when the pandemic happened, people were losing jobs, and that, and they started to express grievances. They, and Trump going on and on about the Chinese virus, China.
Yeah.
Sorry, I saw that Saturday night laughing. I couldn't get it out of my head.
I think some of us saw it as well. Okay. Okay. Someone saying you missed my first question about Tun Mahathir. I'll read it out anyway. I missed it. You're right. I missed it. I was scrolling. I think this one's a simple one. I'm not sure if you're aware of this. It says from Husni Zaini. Thank you, Miss Munira and so on. I'm not sure if you are aware of this, but Tun Mahathir has been named one of the world's most dangerous extremists by the Counter-Extremism Project. What's your take on this?
I thought it was a joke at first, to be honest. So yeah, we cannot all agree with Mahathir, fine, but I also think that it's a bit sus to put him on that list, because I mean, he tweets like an old man shaking his fist at the clouds. So like, why would you put him on that list? So that's a question you should ask CP itself. Like what's up with that?
Well, the list makers, right?
Yeah, like what's your rationalization behind that? It's just bizarre.
Okay. If there are no more spoken questions, I think that there's none here in the written ones.
Sorry,
is there
one question?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
All right. Hi, Munira. A lovely presentation.
I agree.
And I like your piece on overestimating threat levels in the Puchong bombing. Yeah, and my question is that are we underestimating the threat of Malay ethno-nationalist extremism?
So that's a big question, because I think the problem that we're facing right now, because this rise that we're seeing, and they're mostly online. So I have a fear that we might repeat US mistake by thinking that this is just an online thing. Does that make sense? So yeah. I think that at the moment we don't have an actual categories for this type of movements, because it's still, I wouldn't say it's new, but it's kind of newish only because there's a diffusion of political violence across borders, and what we have a tendency to because of social media, we are able to interact and share ideas, and those ideas propagate. So we're only seeing this, and it's more visible now only because of the existence of social media. So I think because it's still like something that's just slowly seeping into our consciousness right now, I think this is something that could potentially will be addressed at some point when it starts to morph into something very insidious.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else?
Hunter?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Munira, are you fine?
yeah,
I will ramble and then give you time if you're fine with. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
One more. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, Arina. Yeah.
So just giving Munira like 5 minutes of break.
Yeah,
Just
yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
so for everyone on the floor, actually take a look on your chat box. One of our committee members has posted something. It is the link to our webinar's feedback. So please take a moment and fill in while I'll proceed with a few questions from students of studies of international terrorism. So there's one question. Wait, let me check. Okay. So, Ms. Munira, as we loomed into 2021, it seems like political right has been gaining momentum since 2020, especially after the last general election. It seems that political parties are taking the populist stance that appeals to the Malay majority. How bad do you think the pressure is for political parties to not lose their votes in the next general election?
I think the pressure will be intense, and I think we can expect more online trolling, more memes, more violent rhetorics being expressed across platforms. There's going to be a lot of xenophobic sentiments. There's going to be a lot of pushbacks against equal rights.
Okay. So another question is, thank you for that. Another question is, seeing the recent news of the attack on the U.S. Capitol by right-wing extremists or Trump supporters, as they called, we wonder how much a violent act could occur in such a democratic state like the US. It begs the question, what can democracy do to prevent extremist violence such as this from happening?
Again, it boils back to the fact that this all happened because of high level enabling in parts of Trump. So the violence we're seeing that when super loose is because of Trump himself, because he's still the president. He gets his say, and he's saying, you know what, do whatever you like. I'm okay with it. So the only way for things to go back to normal, if you can even call it that, is for the leadership itself to expressly and overtly, clearly reject any form of violent extremism.
Okay, all right, thank you. Any other question from the floor?
Yes, I have two short questions, if you don't mind. Thank you, Arina. Thank you, Dr. Meor. Thank you, Ms. Arina. So two very short questions for Ms. Munira. The number one, I was interested. I was wondering if you've ever collaborated with the UN ODC, or the United States Office of Drugs and Crime, because it seems one of the main modules is also counterterrorism. And then second question is, security expert, counterterrorism analyst, and terrorism observer. I was wondering how you got into, specifically how you got into intelligence or counterintelligence. Was it simply an area of interest in your research, or is it part of your fieldwork as well? Thank you.
So I don't think I've directly collaborated with the UN ODC. I've only been to the seminars and webinars and workshops, but not directly collaborated on them with them. To answer your second question is that I think it all happened by chance because so you weren't here when I said it earlier. I wasn't trained in political science. My original background was actually biology, biomedicine, and I did forensic science. But what made me swing from forensics to terrorism was actually I wouldn't say by chance, but I've always had a kind of interest in real world situation, real world problem. And when I was doing forensics, I wasn't very happy in being stuck in the lab all day, and I was more interested in seeing what's going on out there and why people do what they do, and why violent behavior happens. So I just actively start to read up and write up about what I read, and basically I kind of just push myself forward and try to look for any work that relate to my interest. And I think I have to say that I'm quite lucky in that aspect as well. But yeah, if you want to go into this field, I mean, my advice, you just have to sharpen your listening, writing skills. Though these two skills are super important. No, it's three. Sorry, reading, writing, listening. If you're not a good writer, if you're not a good listener, if you're not a good reader, it's very difficult to have a grasp. And you need to be able to process information you see. It doesn't. People say that you need to have this kind of qualifications and everything, but I think that it's this job could use more diversity. It just requires a curious person interested in the world and interested in learning and applying what they learn and put it into policy.
Fantastic. I wouldn't have been able to say it better. Like reading, writing, and speaking and so on. Like I keep on saying it to them. So serves you right, all of you. Okay. Anything else? Anyone else? I think we can. That's enough. I mean, that's just nice. I think like just at the precipice of too much and too little. Just a final call. Any written ones? Any spoken ones?
Can I ask one final
One more?
question?
Is that okay with you, Miss Munira? Is that fine?
Yeah, that's fine. Sorry. Yeah, go on.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is last question.
I think so as well. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, if you allow me.
Yeah.
So, still regarding about the right-wing extremism related to Malaysia, and that some Malay group they want to the Islam, Malay and Islam to dominate. Yeah, because you say that it's about the dominance, it's about power class. So how because Malaysia is now multiracial, multicultural, multi-religion. So how do you see the right wing can combine with the, let's say that one party is a right wing party can combine with the left wing party together in government? I can give you example like UMNO and the APR. So is it possible? That's all. Thank you.
You mean for right wing and left wing to converge together and work together? I mean, I think
Yes.
in some I'm thinking one specific country, but it didn't really end well. I'm thinking they had a mixed government. I could be wrong in thinking. I'm trying to remember the name of the country, Yemen. So that's not a great example. So yeah, I think there is room for cooperation between parties, regardless of the political spectrum. The only issue is when violence is applied to achieve objectives. That's not cool.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we have to think about our constitution as well. I mean, the constitution is always there to
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you,
deep breath, everyone. Thank you for all of us for being here. Thank you for your time, each and every one of you, especially Miss Munira. We appreciate your presence. We appreciate your the time you spend, and I found it extremely interesting. I can't stop thinking about the millions of users, 30 million users in Malaysia, and all of them are able to sort of spark something toxic and so on. Surely there's a way in which we can strike a balance. I think the fear is quite real. Thank you for explaining a bit about the iblises and the shaitans and the gehanas of this world. And know that you always have friends here with us at the circle from the university and so on. We're happy to host. We're happy to speak to individuals like Miss Munira, and any shortcomings on our behalf, we apologize for it. But again, on behalf of the circle, thank you very much. I think Arina, thank you. Is there something you want to say?
Before we ended our session,
yeah, so you ended. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So we have a group picture. So everyone, if you can turn on your camera, if anyone can turn on your camera in 2 minutes, I guess we'll wait.
Okay. I heard. Oh, I saw we had 64 people. 64 on the Zoom.
Great. So few more seconds. Izudin, Usaimin, you ready?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
You just let us know if you want to take the picture. 1, 2, 3, maybe.
All right. So I think that's everyone. So
You sure? Keep on talking for a bit. 10 more seconds so that people can come on.
Okay. All right.
Izudin, say something.
Again, I would like to express our gratitude on behalf of the circle and the university for Miss Munira for such a great session. So yeah, are really looking forward to talk again soon and approach you on different topics perhaps. And inshallah.
Yeah. Okay.
And final, don't forget to fill in the feedback form, everyone. Okay, so yeah, that's all from me. Izudin, already done?
All right, I think ready. In 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's done. Thank you very
All
much.
right, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good question, by the way. Thank you, Miss.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
I mean, miss.
It's okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you. Come again.